The Battle of Dublin was a week of street battles in Dublin from the 28th of June to the 5th of July 1922 that marked the beginning of the Irish Civil War. 6 months after the Anglo-Irish Treaty ended the recent Irish War of Independence, it was fought between the forces of the new provisional government and a section of the Irish Republican Army who opposed the treaty. The fighting began with an assault by provisional government forces on the Four Courts building, which had been occupied by the anti-treaty IRA, and ended in a decisive victory for the provisional government. Background: on the 14th of April 1922, about 200 anti-treaty IRA militants led by Rory O'Connor occupied the Four Courts in Dublin, resulting in a tense standoff. They wanted to spark a new armed confrontation with the British, which they hoped would bring down the Anglo-Irish Treaty, unite the two factions of the IRA against their former common enemy, and thereby restart the fight to create an all-Ireland Irish Republic. At the time, the British Army still had thousands of soldiers concentrated in Dublin, awaiting evacuation. Winston Churchill and the Cabinet of the United Kingdom had been applying pressure on the provisional government to dislodge the rebels in Four Courts, considering their presence there as a violation of the treaty. Such pressure fell heaviest on Michael Collins, arguably the IRA's chief strategist during the War of Independence from Britain. Now President of the Provisional Government Cabinet, and effective head of the regular National Army, Collins had resisted giving open battle to his erstwhile brothers-in-arms since they first occupied Four Courts the preceding April. Collins' colleagues in the Provisional Government Cabinet, including Arthur Griffith, continually joined their voices to demands that Collins mount decisive military action against the anti-treaty garrison at Four Courts. In the month of June 1922, the Provisional Government engaged in intense negotiations with the British Cabinet over a draft constitution, which sought to defuse the threat of civil war imminently impending. They particularly sought to remove the requirement of an oath to the British Crown by all members of the Dublin government, a key point of contention with anti-treaty partisans. However, the conservative British cabinet refused to cooperate. The pro-treaty element of Sinn Féin won the elections on the 16th of June, following the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson in London on the 22nd of June 1922, and the arrest by Four Courts troops of Free State Army General, Deputy Chief of Staff J.J. O'Connell. British pressure on the provisional government magnified to military ultimatum. The risk of re-invasion by the British now entered the question. Those determined to make the Free State into a viable, self-governing Irish state now had few alternatives. On the 27th of June, the Provisional Government Cabinet agreed an ultimatum to the Four Courts garrison to evacuate or face immediate military action. Churchill offered a loan of British artillery for use by the National Army along with 200 from their store of 10,000 shells at Kilmainham, 3 miles away. It is possible that some British specialist troops were also covertly loaned. Two 18-pounder field guns were placed on Parliament Street and Winnet-Avern Street, across the River Liffey from the Four Courts complex. After an ultimatum was delivered to the anti-treaty garrison on the night of the 27th of June, early hours of the 28th of June, the National Army commenced the bombardment of Four Courts. However, no authoritative record exists as to the order to commence bombardment, when it was issued, by whom, where, etc. Historians have tended to attribute the order to Collins, but biographers dispute this. Anti-treaty survivors alleged that they were preparing for an 8 a.m. evacuation, when the bombardment began at 4 a.m. The assault on the Four Courts. Inside the building were 12 members of the Irish Republican Army executive, including Chief of Staff Joe McKelvey, Director of Engineering Rory O'Connor, and Quartermaster General Liam Mellows. The garrison consisted of roughly 180 men drawn from the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the IRA's 1st Dublin Brigade. commanded by Commandant Paddy O'Brien, armed for the most part only with small arms, apart from one captured armoured car, which they named the Mutineer. The members of the IRA Army Executive were the political leaders of the garrison, but served as common soldiers under the command of Ernie O'Malley, commander of the IRA's 2nd Southern Division. The anti-treaty side fortified the forecourts to some extent, planting mines around the complex and barricading the doors and windows. But their leadership ordered them not fire first, to retain the moral high ground, and so the Free State troops were allowed to surround the forecourts. After the first day's bombardment proved ineffective, the British gave the Free State 2 more 18-pounder cannon, and offered 60-pounder howitzers and even to bomb the forecourts from the air. Collins turned down the latter two offers because of the risk of causing heavy civilian casualties. On the 29th, Free State troops stormed the eastern wing of the forecourts, losing 3 killed and 14 wounded and taking 33 prisoners. The Republicans' armored car, the Mutineer, was also disabled and abandoned by its crew. Early the next day, Paddy O'Brien was injured by shrapnel and Ernie O'Malley took over military command in the forecourts. By this time, the shelling had caused the forecourts to catch fire. In addition, orders arrived from Oscar Traynor, the anti-treaty IRA commander in Dublin, for the forecourts garrison to surrender, as he could not reach their position to help them. At 3:30 p.m. on the 30th of June, O'Malley surrendered the forecourts to Brigadier General Paddy Daly, of the Free State's Dublin Guard unit. 3 of the Republican garrison had died in the siege explosion in the forecourts several hours before the surrender, at either 11:30 or 2:15. The Irish Public Record Office, located in the western block of the forecourts, which had been used as an ammunition store by the forecourts garrison, was the centre of a huge explosion, blowing to pieces 1,000 years of Irish state and religious archives. 40 advancing Free State troops were badly injured. It was alleged by the National Army headquarters that the anti-treaty forces deliberately booby-trapped the Public Record Office to kill advancing Free State troops. Tim Healy, a government supporter, later alleged that the explosion was the result of landmines laid before the surrender, which exploded after the surrender. However, a study of the battle concluded that the explosion was caused by fires ignited by the shelling of the forecourts, which eventually reached 2 truckloads of gelignite in the munitions factory. A towering mushroom cloud rose 200 feet over the forecourts. Calton Younger identified 3 explosions, 2 beneath the records office at about 2:15 p.m., and another at the back of the building at about 5 o'clock. At this stage in the war, troops on each side still had a sense of kinship with the other, as most of them had fought together in the Irish Republican Army during the Irish War of Independence. By appealing to friends on the Free State side, several anti-treaty leaders among the forecourts garrison, notably Ernie O'Malley and Sean Lamass, escaped from captivity to continue fighting elsewhere. O'Connell Street fighting. Despite the Free State forces' success in taking the forecourts, fighting continued in Dublin until the 5th of July. On the 29th, anti-treaty IRA units from the Dublin Brigade led by Oscar Traynor had occupied O'Connell Street to try to distract Free State attention from their attack on the forecourts. Not all of the IRA units in the capital were prepared to fight against the new Irish government, however, and the numbers were probably about 500. Throughout the city, the Republicans occupied the northeastern part of O'Connell Street, with their strong point at the Block, a group of buildings which the anti-treatyites had connected by tunneling through the walls. They had also taken over the adjoining Gresham, Crown, Granville, and Hammam hotels. Their only position on the western side of the street was in the YMCA building. Additionally, they had an outpost south of the Liffey at the Swan Pub on Ongea Street. Oscar Traynor apparently hoped to receive reinforcements from the rest of the country, but only anti-treaty units in Belfast and Tipperary replied, and both of them arrived too late to take part in the fighting. The Provisional Government troops, commanded by General Tom Ennis, started by clearing the outlying anti-treaty garrisons, which they had done by the 1st of July. They then drew a tighter cordon around O'Connell Street. Artillery was used to drive the anti-treaty fighters out of positions on Parnell Street and Gardiner Street, which gave the Free State troops a clear field of fire down O'Connell Street. The Republican outpost in the YMCA was eliminated when Free State troops tunneled underneath it and detonated a bomb. Trainers men in the block held out until artillery was brought up, under the cover of armored cars, to bombard them at point-blank range. Incendiary bombs were also planted in the buildings. Oscar Traynor and most of his men made their escape when the buildings they were holding caught fire. They mingled into civilian crowds and made their way to Blessington. Left behind was Republican leader Cathal Brugha and a rearguard of 15 men, who stayed behind in the Haman Hotel after Traynor and most other IRA men had left. At 5 p.m. on the 5th of July, when the fires made the hotel untenable, Brugha ordered his men to surrender. He, however, stayed behind, only to emerge from the building alone, armed with a revolver. He was shot in the thigh when he left the burning building alone to confront the Free State troops and died later from blood loss. There were some further sporadic incidents of fighting around the city as Free State troops dispersed anti-treaty IRA groups. Cathal Brugha was the last casualty in the Battle for Dublin, which had cost both sides 65 killed and 280 wounded. In addition, the Free State took over 400 Republican prisoners. The civilian casualties are thought to have numbered well over 250. The high civilian casualties were doubtless the result of the use of heavy weapons, especially artillery, in a densely populated urban area. Aftermath. When the fighting in Dublin died down, the Free State government was left firmly in control of the Irish capital and the anti-treaty forces dispersed around the country. Roundups after the fighting captured more Republican prisoners and resulted in the death of prominent anti-treaty activist Harry Boland, who was shot dead in Skerries on the 31st of July. Oscar Traynor, Ernie O'Malley and the other anti-treaty fighters who had escaped the fighting in Dublin regrouped in Blessington, around 30 kilometers southwest of the city. An anti-treaty IRA force from County Tipperary had arrived there but was too late to participate in the Dublin fighting. Instead, this force headed south and took a string of towns, including Enniscorthy and Carlow, but quickly abandoned them when faced with superior Free State forces. Most of the Republicans then retreated further south again to the so-called Munster Republic territory southwest of a line running from Limerick to Waterford. This in turn was taken by the Free State in an offensive from July to August 1922. Four of the Republican leaders captured in the Four Courts, Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey and Richard Barrett, were later executed by the government in reprisal for the anti-treaty side's killing of T.D. Sean Hales. The street where Cathal Brugha was killed was later renamed Cathal Brugha Street in his honour. Destruction of Irish historical records. On the 22nd of June 1922, in an attempt to dislodge anti-treaty forces holed up there, pro-treaty salvos launched into the complex housing stored anti-treaty munitions led to an enormous out-of-control fire. The massive conflagration spread rapidly, destroying the buildings and, with them, it led to the almost total destruction of the mass of Irish historical records archived in the Public Records Office of Ireland. As this closely followed the 1921 destruction of centuries of other important Irish record fonds kept in the Custom House, Dublin. The cumulative effect was the devastating annihilation of a huge swath of Ireland's historical resources, to the loss of all future researchers seeking to document many aspects of Irish history. Subsequent efforts by archivists and other interested parties have played an extremely important role in attempting to replace what was lost, but Though an impressive inventory of material has been amassed, continues to accumulate, and is now housed in the National Archives of Ireland. Much of what was lost in the 1922 fire was irreplaceable. Which side bore the burden of the blame for the fire led to recriminations in the fire's aftermath. But the question of which side was ultimately responsible remains unresolved. The state of the record. It is generally allowed by historians that these events, which set off the catastrophic Civil War, irrevocably altering the course of Irish history, have been poorly recorded, understudied, fraught with political controversy, and would reward further research.